A lot of the analyses that we have looked at obviously focus on the question who's going to vote yes, who's going to vote no, and why. But the key question is, of course, can anything change? And that came out in the discussion just in after the previous talk already. The key realm, obviously, where change could happen are the undecideds. That's probably, if you can't convince people who haven't made up their minds, going to be very hard to pull people out of the other side, basically. And that's why we thought it would be quite sensible to engage in a bit more depth with the undecideds here in this talk. So we're going to have a look at who the undecideds are. The question is, are they just the usual suspects? Or is there something else going on? We're going to look a bit at the reasons characterizing those undecided and ask what that might mean for turnout and the conclusions for the campaigns. So the usual suspects, people might argue, obviously, as have been claimed in a lot of debates, follow particular demographics. Have been argued that it might have to do with social class, with age, that maybe the young would be more undecided, but also in particular that maybe the undecideds are simply those who don't really care about it. They might exist. Maybe it's just people that don't care, they won't vote, they can't be swung over, and we shouldn't spend any time focusing on them. Now, crucially, first of all, is that it matters to engage with them because it is quite a large group. We have about a third of respondents that would say that they have not made up their mind yet if we ask the question in a way that permits them to say this. So we asked a question that explicitly asked whether people had made their mind up or not. If you looked at a lot of the polls, sometimes you get figures only around 20%, and that's very often because the question in those polls was asked right at the beginning, simply when you pick up the phone, this is a survey, will you take part? And the question was, should Scotland be an independent country? Now, if you ask that, you'll have fewer people say undecided as compared to when you ask, have you made your mind up? And if you have, is it yes or no? So if you ask people, we get about a third that says, I have not made my mind up. So it's a substantial group of people, and it's worth engaging with them a bit more and knowing a bit more about them. So we'll start with looking at some of the demographics about them. One finding that's not surprising, considering a lot of previous work that we've seen, is that men tend to be more decided. It's about a 10% difference. So we only, of the group, men have a slightly higher likelihood of having made up their mind. As we will see later on, though, we might be able to explain that by other factors. So this difference of about 10% between men and women might be explained by other factors. But it's definitely a demographic finding that we've seen before and that does exist. Now, the second one is age, and age is quite interesting. If you look across our age groups here, then we do see that actually the percentage of those undecideds, that's always the white figure in those red bars, doesn't differ too much between our age groups. Sure, there are a few more undecideds in the 25 to 34 group. There are a bit fewer ones in the 65 plus groups. But what's very clear, it's not a linear pattern here. What we don't see is something that as people get older, they're definitely more decided or the other way around. We don't really see any particular trends in this. So while there is a little bit of variation, there's clearly not a massive amount of difference based on age groups with regards to decision-making on independence. So we can't simply say that the age demographic characteristics let us understand who has made up their mind and who hasn't. Social class has sometimes been claimed to be a decisive factor in this, but again, the differences aren't that strong. The strongest deviation from most of the other groups is the small employers and own account workers, but that is also by far the smallest group in our sample. So there is a greater margin of error coming into that as well. If you look at all the others, you do find that there's not too much difference. And if you kind of use this hierarchy of social classes, then you actually see that the employers, managerial professions have about the same proportion undecided as those who are in semi-routine and routine occupations. So again, there's not a clear hierarchy that would allow us to find out who really are the undecideds and who aren't. It would not be possible to target and direct probably efforts specifically based on these simple socio-demographic characteristics. Now, another way of looking at it, now not a socio-demographic one, but one that played a lot of role in a lot of the discussions surrounding the yes-no vote as well, it came up in the previous conversations as well, is that of national identity. And we thought maybe decidedness has to do with stronger identification or less strong identification. So we grouped those together who we called have a sole identity. Those were the ones who said that they are Scottish, not British, or at the other end of the spectrum, a smaller group that said British, not Scottish, as you've seen before, and all the mixed identities together, so kind of more Scottish than British, more British than Scottish, or equally Scottish and British. And we do see a bit of a difference. It's not massive, it's a 7% difference, but it goes a bit in this direction that if you have a clear national identity, a sole identity we called it, then you're somewhat more likely to have made up your mind than if you have kind of mixed identities. That might not be completely surprising. It's not a huge difference, though, I said. It is robust in our further analysis, though. So this difference seems to persist even once we control for socio-demographic factors. So it is something that exists. But again, it probably wouldn't be enough to say, well, the campaigns are now going to go out and change all their policies targeting, particularly based on that. Now, when I talked about controlling for some of these factors, and I'll use a word of caution, I won't bore you with detailed statistical results that go now into these models. We have put them together in so-called logistic regression models, where as our outcome variable, we have looked at whether people are undecided or have made up their mind. Yeah? So the question of interest is, have people made up their mind or not? And what we do see is indeed that the difference between men and women comes in. So women are more likely to be undecided. And as we said, that national identity, if you have a dual national identity or mixed national identity, then also you were more likely to be undecided. And that is robust even when we control for sex, but also for age and social class. So the relationships we found for for social class and age were not robust. Once we controlled for these other factors, they were not statistically significant. But we have them in as controls. So what we clearly see is that simply looking at demographics and basic characteristics is not sufficient to identify what proportion of the population and which groups in the population might be undecided and which ones aren't. We need something else. So we moved on and thought about, well, the second bit about the usual suspects that we heard on a lot of the commentary is, well, it's the people that simply don't care. They don't think this might matter to them, and therefore they will be undecided because they might not go voting and so on. So we looked at the variable about political interest. That in itself is fairly simple. We have a very symmetric distribution. Most people are somewhere in the middle about the question how strong their general political interest is. And we have a small group, about 10%, that says they have a great deal or no interest at all. So most people have some political interest. Very few are at the extremes. And now what we might expect to find is that the lower your political interest, the higher the likelihood that you are undecided, if that usual suspects dynamic were true. And we do find a little bit of a relationship indeed. We do find that pattern to some extent replicated, that those who are less politically interested tend to be somewhat more undecided. However, an important note for caution here. If you look at it, the real big differences are between the extremes, between those who have a really great deal of political interest and who are likely to have made up their mind, and those who have no political interest at all, of which about half have not made up their mind. But do remember, those were quite small groups. We're talking here really about the margins. We talk about 10% in each group. The 80% in the middle are actually relatively close together. We still see a little bit of a gradient, a difference between quite a lot and some political interest of 6% more undecidedness and so on, but it's by far not as strong a relationship. So it's something we want to look at quite carefully later on and control for some of our other variables to see whether we can explain why some of these differences are there. So in short, yes, the usual suspects argument plays a little bit of a role here. We definitely do see that people who are not politically interested at all have a much higher likelihood of being undecided. However, again, basing our argument now that we could clearly identify who will be undecided or not is very problematic, because for the largest proportion of the population, about 80% here, what we see is only a little bit of variation within political interest. Finally, another one of the basic characteristics when we look at general political orientations is, of course, identification with political parties. Now, the first thing we see is that if you don't feel close to any political party, so this is the widest definition, it includes people who say, I vote for this party, I support this party, or I feel close to a political party. Those who do not identify with any political party have a higher likelihood of being undecided. So if you do identify with a party, there is a greater likelihood that you have made up your mind, because obviously there's something maybe to anchor your views in. However, having said this, there's some quite substantial variation. People who identify as conservative or liberal Democrat mostly have made up their mind, it seems. Whereas people who identify with Labour or the Scottish National Party have a higher likelihood of being undecided still. Not as undecided as those who do not identify with any party, but clearly there is much more indecision in these groups. So this is quite interesting in itself, because it clearly shows us this is not homogeneous within the campaigns. So within the Better Together campaign, which Labour obviously would be a part of, we do see that there is a higher degree of indecision compared to the other identification with Better Together-oriented parties. So this is something to keep in mind for the analysis. And it helps us complete a bit of the picture of which factors might come into characterizing our undecideds. If we add that to our model and control for this, we also see that these effects are largely robust. So the political interest pattern that we have seen is significantly related to indecision. And so is the comparison between those who do not identify with any party and those who identify with the Conservatives or Liberal Democrats. However, the difference that we saw between those who don't identify with any political party and those who identify with Labour or the SNP, that one did not turn out to be statistically significant. So it's partially a function of the characteristics of those that will identify with these parties based on socio-demographic differences, for example. Okay, now we have said there's a little bit going on about our usual suspects dynamics, something about political interest, something about party alignment, very little about demographics. The gender difference is there, but apart from this, there's not too much going on. So there must be something else, unless it's completely random. And we're looking at two things that are very important and maybe not given enough attention to in the debates. The first one is about efficacy, the feeling of how much people actually feel the campaigns matter to them and how much they can take part in it. And the second is about the process of the referendum itself. We've already seen quite a lot of people don't feel that they have particularly much knowledge about independence. This relates to those questions about uncertainty that we've heard about in the previous talk. And indeed, there's some relationship. So people who feel that they know more about independence are more likely to have made up their minds. So this substantiates some of the discussions from earlier about that there is something to be done with people who are uncertain, who don't feel that they have these sorts of knowledge. And obviously, probably engaging with them, not simply through campaigning, but by giving a feeling of making them more aware of really translating the feeling of here's not just information, but this is information that informs you, that might shift people in one direction, making up their mind a bit more. Second, we looked at self-perceived understanding. So we had this statement, the debate about independence is so complicated, a person like me cannot really make much sense of it. And what you do see is that actually quite a lot of people agree with this, or are kind of in the middle ground. Interestingly enough, though, there's a bit of a gradient that we see here, similar to the knowledge one. So if you feel that you don't understand it. So if you strongly agree with the statement, you are more likely to be undecided, but the gradient's not very strong. Have a look again. The margins, the extremes aren't particularly large. So if you focus on the 3 middle categories, there's a little bit going on, but it's not as stark a difference as we've seen, for example, for the knowledge question. Very interestingly, and I think one of the most important questions because it relates to this notion of people will vote in certain ways because of how it affects their life in real terms, is the question of whether people think that independence would make a difference to their actual lives. Again, we see few people in the extremes, a bit more maybe to the great deal than none at all, but relatively symmetric, the distribution here again. And here we do see quite a strong gradient. Again, I caution a bit about looking at the extremes, but if you look at the middle groups, it becomes very clear. People who think that independence will matter to their life are more likely to make up their mind. That might sound a little trivial, but it's actually really important, because if people don't have the feeling that this is something important that affects their life, as long as it stays more in the abstract, they're less likely to probably make a decision. That also means, in the other way around, that those people who currently don't have the feeling that this is something that affects their lives are the ones that where the greatest room for further engagement is, both for academics, I guess, to inform the debate, but also for the campaigns to engage with, I think. Now, interestingly, once we take these measures of self-efficacy and understanding in, some of the other things are explained. So the gender difference disappears, so which we know women are more likely to say that they don't know enough yet, that they want more information. But also the political interest one actually becomes insignificant. So some of this gets explained if we understand a bit more about people's orientation and understandings of those political issues. The one about knowledge and the ones in particular about whether life is affected, they really, really matter. Now, finally, after having looked at these sorts of issues about kind of self-perceptions, we said there's one crucial element we should really have a look at as well, and that is whether people are actually happy with the process. Because there was a lot of debate before these questions were made up, the referendum question made up, of whether there should be one or there should be 2 questions. And we know that an option quite a lot of people favor, about 1/3 here, is something that has been termed devo max, or further devolution, and so on. So this is here basically by saying that the Scottish Parliament should have more powers, but not all the powers, especially about foreign affairs and defence, should remain in the UK. So we might use the shorthand devo max for this here. So that's about 1/3 of the people that said this in our survey. And maybe not surprisingly, nearly half of those who favored that option are undecided, whereas the rest, all the other preference taken together, it's only about 30% who are undecided. So there is a substantial group, about 1/3 out there, that doesn't have their first preference on the ballot paper. So clearly, the campaigns have not gotten those groups completely yet, those people out there, and there's room for engagement, and it's clear those people need to be convinced what basically the second best option to their first preference is, but they haven't been convinced yet. Indecision is much higher amongst this group. Even more so, there was a large group, even people who didn't favor devolution max, if I can use that shorthand, more than half said they would have preferred a second question in the referendum. And amongst those, we also find that the degree of indecision was higher. So 40% of those who would have liked a second question, regardless of what their own constitutional preference was, would have are still undecided. Whereas those who are happy with just asking about independence, that proportion is much lower. So there's something about the process in here, and a group that probably needs more engagement with. And that is maybe the group, answering some of the questions from the first discussion, where there could be some shifts still in the future. But that might be something interesting to discuss further as well. All these effects are robust. So once we've taken in these efficacy accounts, these additional effects of looking at the preference for constitutional arrangements, as well as having a second question, so about the process, there are quite strong effects in the model, even controlling for socio-demographics, efficacy, party orientation, and so on. Now, finally, just to have a quick look, Does this matter? To some extent, obviously, the question was, do these things matter for the referendum vote in the end? First of all, just to reiterate something, we expect a high turnout to this referendum. So this is, we had a 0 to 10 scale, and 10 says, I'm very likely to go. Basically, I'll go. And we see that's over 60%, which is massive. If we've asked this about the general election, we'd get a much lower turnout. That's very, very clear. So we expect a high turnout across the entire population, actually, comparing this to other data we had. Now, it is important to note, though, amongst those who currently say they are undecided, those who say they will definitely go effectively, who give a rating of 10, is lower. It's only 50% compared to over 70% amongst those who are decided. That might be explained by two things. One, obviously, there is a small group of people, our usual suspects, who don't have an interest. There will always be some people who will remain disinterested, probably. But it also tells us that amongst those undecided, still 50% say they will definitely go. And a lot of them gave it a 9 or an 8 as a rating. So a lot of those undecideds will actually turn out and vote, as we would expect now. And that means it is quite important to engage with them potentially, and where something can still be done, because, as we've seen already, there's no particular leaning one way or another. There's no strong kind of predisposition to voting yes or no if you are undecided at the moment. So just to conclude these points, and then hopefully have some interesting discussions on this, there's still about a third of voters that hasn't made up their mind. And I think it's important to engage with them first, because even if you have made up your mind, maybe you change your view. But if you can't engage with them, it's very unlikely, I think, that you move much further. Some of them belong in this usual suspects category. Very little on the demographics, and that's quite important to note probably. But there are a few who are just politically disinterested. But it's a minority. We can explain the gender difference if we look at efficacy, understanding. And we find some difference between the political parties, first of all, between no political party orientation at all and being having an identification with a political party, but also within, in particular within the Better Together campaigns, differences between Conservatives and Lib Dems being much more decided, and Labour identifies less so. And finally, on national identity, we have seen, obviously, that there's a little bit going on with those who have a more clear identification. Finally, and I think those probably are the more important findings from this, is that efficacy matters. There's clearly something about people's understanding of, does this matter to me, and do I understand this? And there's more that can be done in this area, and there's probably room for the campaigns also to engage more effectively with those groups. And second of all, one of the key things to grab quite large groups of those undecideds is probably to present the option that they would consider their second best preference, which clearly hasn't convinced a lot of them yet. What is the next best preference to devolution max? Voting yes or no, where are the best outcomes coming from? And that might be what can, maybe one want to say should, dominate some of the debates over the next period. Thank you very much.